The sky above the Pacific Northwest had always been wide and gray. In the mornings, thick clouds rolled in from the ocean every day, and the tall trees stood so close together that the light barely reached the ground. It was the kind of place where a person could walk for hours and not hear a single human voice, only birds, only wind, only the slow, deep sounds of the forest doing what it had always done. That Tuesday morning, the sky changed. Dan Cooper was crouched behind a mossy rock about 3 meters deep into the Olympic National Forest. When he first saw it, he had been watching a wolf, a gray female. He had been tracking for 6 weeks, move quietly through the ferns along the creek bed. He had his notebook out. He had his binoculars around his neck. He was doing exactly what he did every morning, which was watching animals and writing down what they did. Then the clouds lit up orange. It was not lightning. Lightning came and went fast. This light stayed. It moved slowly across the sky from west to east, and it was so bright that the wolf stopped walking and looked up. Dan watched her ears go flat. She turned and disappeared into the trees without making a sound. He stood up slowly and looked through his binoculars at the sky. There were ships up there, big ones, not planes, not satellites, ships with flat, dark undersides and lights running along their edges in slow pulses. They were coming down, not crashing, landing. Controlled, steady, deliberate. Whatever was flying them knew exactly what it was doing. Dan counted 4 ships before they dropped below the tree in about 2 meters to his north, and the forest shook. When they landed, he felt it through his boots. Birds exploded out of the canopy in every direction, thousands of them, all at once, filling the air with noise, and then vanishing west toward the coast. He stood still for about 30 seconds, then he pulled out his satellite phone and called Lucy Grant. Lucy was at the research station 40 mi east, sitting at a small wooden desk with a mug of coffee going cold beside her keyboard. She picked up on the second ring. They landed in the forest. Dan said. Lucy did not say anything for a moment. How many ships? 4 that I saw, maybe more. They came down about 2 meters north of the creek crossing. Are you safe for now? He said. The wolves already left, and that is probably a good sign for me and a bad sign for whoever just landed. Lucy pulled up her satellite map on the screen. She zoomed into the Olympic Peninsula and stared at the topography: dense forest, steep ridges, river valleys running north to south, no roads within 5 meters of where Dan was describing, no towns, no infrastructure of any kind. They picked the most remote spot they could find, she said. That is what I thought too, Dan replied. They probably think remote means empty. He was already moving north, staying low, keeping to the thick brush along the creek. He was not going toward the ships out of bravery. He was going because he needed to see what was happening, and because 15 years of working in this forest had made him very good at moving through it without being seen or heard. The breath Dominion had, and in fact chosen the Pacific Northwest for exactly the reason Lucy suspected. Their orbital surveys had flagged it as low density in terms of human settlement. Forests were obstacles, not threats. The plan was to establish a ground base quickly, begin resource extraction from the river systems, and expand outward once the perimeter was secure. Commander Orvac of the Breath Ground Division stood at the base of his ship's ramp and looked out at the trees. They were taller than he had expected, the air was cold and wet, and it smelled of things he had no name for. His sensors showed organic life all around, dense, layered, moving, but nothing his combat systems classified as a threat. No energy signatures, no weapons, no military hardware of any kind. He ordered his scouts forward, and the first team moved into the trees with their equipment, scanners, mapping, drones, perimeter beacons. They were efficient and fast. They had done this on 11 other worlds. The process was simple. You went in, you mapped the ground, you set the perimeter, and then the engineers came in behind you. They had been in the trees for about 9 minutes when the first drone went down. It was a Cougar. She had been resting on a branch 15 ft above the trail the drone was following, and she dropped onto it the way Cougars drop onto deer. Vast, accurate, completely silent until the moment of impact. The drone hit the ground in 3 pieces. The Cougar sniffed at the wreckage, decided it was not food, and walked away into the ferns. The scout team stopped. They looked at each other. They looked at the broken drone. They filed a report. Mayorvac read it and moved on. Wildlife interference. It happened. They would recalibrate the drones to fly higher. 20 minutes later, a black bear pushed through the side of a supply container that had been set near the tree line. The container held fuel compounds for the ship's biological processors. The compounds, as it turned out, smelled almost exactly like rotting salmon too. The bear wanted whatever was making that smell. She tore the panel off the side of the container with the same easy effort she used to pull apart a rotten log looking for grubs. She stuck her head inside, decided it was not actually salmon, and knocked the entire container over on her way out. Fuel spilled across the ground. 2 of Orvac's engineers spent the next hour cleaning it up and filing their own reports. Dan Cooper watched all of this from 200 YD away, lying flat in the ferns with his binoculars up. He watched the bear. He watched the aliens standing around the tipped container in their dark, smooth suits, moving in quick, precise ways that reminded him of insects. He watched the way they kept looking at the forest around them, scanning, nervous, trying to understand a place they had never been. He had seen that look before, not on aliens, on tourists who wandered into the back country without knowing what they were walking into. He pulled out his notebook and wrote, "They do not know where they are." Then he wrote, "The forest does." He carefully backed away through the ferns, moving the way he had learned to move years ago, slowly, no sudden motions, weight on the outside of the foot, always watching where he put his hands. He reached the creek bed and followed it east without ever standing fully upright. By the time he was a mile away, he could hear Orvac's team on their radio frequencies, not the words, just the rhythm of stressed, rapid communication. Something else had happened. He did not know what yet. Later he would find out. It was the wolves. The gray female he had been watching that morning had not gone far. She had circled back with 4 others from her pack, and they had spent 40 minutes moving around the outer edge of the breath perimeter in slow, careful loops, testing it, watching the lights and the sounds and the strange new shapes that had appeared in their territory. They were not attacking, they were just doing what wolves did. They were learning the shape of the new thing in their forest. Orvac filed his 3rd report of the morning. It was only 8:45. He wrote, "Local fauna are aggressive. advising caution. He did not yet understand that the fauna were not being aggressive, they were simply being themselves, and on this world being themselves was more than enough. Dan reached the edge of the tree just before noon and looked out at the distant ridge where Lucy's research station sat. He started walking. There was a lot to talk about and not much time to waste. Behind him, deep in the forest, the ravens had found the broken drone. They were taking it apart piece by piece, carrying the shiny bits up into the branches, dropping them, picking them up again. One of them had found a lens component and was rolling it back and forth on a log with what looked very much like satisfaction. The forest was paying attention, and it always had been. 3 days after the landing, the VRTH had built a perimeter. It was a good perimeter by their standards. Sonic emitters on metal posts, spaced 30 ft apart, sending out low pulses that had driven away the native animals on every world they had used them on before. A plasma fence ran inside the emitter line, a thin wall of charged energy that would stop anything biological from pushing through, and inside that sent suppressors pumped out a chemical signal that the breath xenobiologists had found through previous research caused most large animals to feel uneasy and move away. All of this technology had worked before. On other worlds, the animals had heard the sonic pulses and left. They had smelled the suppressors and turned around. They had seen the fence glow and kept their distance. The animals of the Pacific Northwest did not read the same manual. On the first morning after the perimeter went up, Commander Orvac stood at the edge of the compound and watched his sensor board with a look on his face that his crew had not seen before. It was the look of a person who has pressed a button many times and expected a certain result, and the result is not happening. The sonic emitters were running. The wolves were still there, 6 of them sitting in a loose half circle at the tree and watching the compound. They were not running. They were not even standing. They were sitting the way wolves sit when they have nowhere particular to be, relaxed, alert, completely at ease. One of them yawned. Orvac turned up the frequency on the emitters. The wolf's ears moved. One of them tilted his head slightly, and then they all went back to watching prey. The breath xenologist assigned to the ground team had been filing reports every few hours since the landing. He was a careful, methodical scientist who had spent his career studying alien ecosystems, and he was for the first time in that career deeply unsettled. He wrote in his log, "The sonic deterrent system appears to be a subject of curiosity rather than distress for the local canid population. Further study required." What he did not write because it was not the kind of thing you put in an official log was what he had felt when one of the wolves looked directly at him through the fence, not with fear, not with confusion, with a kind of flat, a steady assessment that reminded him uncomfortably of the way senior breath commanders looked at junior officers. They had not yet decided what to do with the plasma fence. Had its own problems, and Elk had walked into it on the second day, not on purpose. It simply had not seen it. The fence discharged. The Elk, a large female, stumbled back, shook her head, stood still for about 4 seconds, and then walked into the fence again, harder. The fence discharged again. The Elk walked away. 2 hours later, 3 more elk pushed through the same section. They had seen the first one do it, and apparently decided it was worth trying. The fence held, but one of the posts was now leaning at an angle and sparking in a way that made the engineering team nervous. The ravens were the real problem, though. Nobody had expected the ravens when the plasma fence had discharged on the elk. It had made a bright flash and a loud crack. Ravens, there were perhaps 24 of them in the trees nearby, had all turned their heads toward the sound at exactly the same moment. Then they had begun flying toward the compound in small groups, landing on the tops of the emitter posts, walking along the plasma fence housing, pecking at anything that moved or shone. One raven found the optical cover on a surveillance drone and removed it in about 45 seconds of focused, efficient work. The drone went blind. Another raven figured out that the antenna coupling on one of the perimeter beacons could be pulled loose with the right angle of beacon body weight. It pulled it loose. The beacon went offline. Supre watched all of this and added to his log, local corvid species demonstrating problem-solving behavior at a level that is frankly difficult to categorize. Recommend we do not leave any equipment unattended outside the main vessel. Meanwhile, 40 mi east, Dan Cooper had reached Lucy Grant's research station. Lucy had a satellite map spread across her table, printed out in sections and taped together. She had been marking it with a pen, drawing the rough locations of the landing sites based on what Dan had described and cross-referencing them with her wildlife data files. She had files on everything: wolf territories, bear ranges, cougar corridors, bird migration paths, river crossings used by elk. She had been building this map of the living forest for 11 years, and now she was looking at it in a completely new way. Dan sat down across from her and looked at the map. They set up right here, he said, pointing in the middle of the lower Pax territory. I know, Lucy said, and look at this. She pointed to a series of red lines on the map, migration corridors she had drawn years ago based on seasonal animal movement. 3 of them crossed within a 4 mile of where the breath had landed. Elk come through here in 9 days. Rut season. Dan looked at the lines. He was quiet for a moment. They don't know what rut season is, he said. They are about to find out, Lucy replied. She had already made contact with several other biologists and park rangers across the region. None of them were soldiers. None of them had any kind of military background. What they had was decades of knowledge about how the forest worked, where the animals were, and then how those animals behaved when something entered their territory. A man named Pete Owens arrived at the station that evening. He drove a dusty truck and wore a jacket that had seen too many winters. He was a retired Army ranger who had come back to the Northwest after his service and spent the last decade as a hunting guide. He had the kind of stillness about him that came from years of waiting quietly in the woods for something to happen. He looked at Lucy's map for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "They've got no idea where they landed, do they?" "None," Dan said. Pete put his finger on a ridge north of the compound. "Cougar territory, 3 females and a male that I know of." He moved his finger east. "Bear corridor. Here, browns and blacks both use it when the berries come in." He tapped a valley to the west. "Elk crossing used every season for as long as anyone can remember." He leaned back. "They built their fence in the middle of everything that moves through this country. Lucy nodded. And the animals are not going to stop moving because of a fence. Pete was quiet again for a moment, then he said, we don't have to do anything dramatic. We just have to make sure nothing gets in the way of what the forest was already going to do. That was the beginning of what nobody ever officially named, but what Dan later described in his notes as the most disorganized and effective wildlife coordination effort in human history. They were not giving orders to the animals. That was not how it worked. What they were doing was much simpler. They were removing barriers, moving things that blocked natural paths, and noting where animals already wanted to go and making sure nothing stopped them from getting there. Back at the VRI compound, Orvac was on his fourth report of the day. 2 more drones down, 1 perimeter post completely dismantled by ravens, a section of fence pushed out of alignment by what the sensors said was a group of large deer moving through in the dark. He sat in his command seat and looked at the damage report. 47 worlds. Not one had done this. He sent the report to High Sovereign Z on the fleet ship above. He included the sensor logs. He included profiled notes. He included photographs of the ravens pulling apart the beacon antenna. ZTH read the report. In his command chamber, he was a large being, old in his position, experienced in the way that comes from long years of winning. He read the drone damage logs, and he read the fence breach reports. He looked at the photograph of the raven with the antenna coupling in its beak. He sent back one line: eliminate the wildlife. Orvac looked at the reply. He pulled up the bioscanner data. It covered the forest in every direction as far as the scanner could read. The readings were almost solid with organic life: birds, bears, wolves, elk, deer, rodents, insects, layered and packed and moving in every direction at all hours. He typed back slowly, High Sovereign, there are a great many of them. There was a long pause. Then how many? Orvac looked at the scanner. A grizzly bear had sat on one of the external sensor nodes that morning and bent the casing. The scanner was still recalibrating. He typed, still counting. Outside the compound in the growing dark, the wolves had come back, and they were sitting at the tree again watching. One of them made a short, low sound, not a howl, just a quiet note passing between the pack. Then they all got up and melted back into the trees. They would be back before morning. They always came back on the 5th day after the first landing. 2 more VHT ships came down. The second landed in the wide, open grasslands of eastern Montana, about 30 mi from the nearest town. Land was flat there and dry, and from the air it probably looked empty. Long stretches of pale grass, a few ranch roads cutting across the plains like thin scars, no visible settlements for miles in any direction. The breath chose it for the same reason they had chosen the Pacific Northwest. They saw space and assumed it meant nothing was there. But the grasslands of Montana were not empty if they were full of cattle. Calberton ran 61 years of the same ranch his grandfather had built with his own hands on land that his family had worked for 3 generations. He was not a loud man. He was not a complicated man. He got up before the sun. He worked until after dark, and he did not say much that he did not mean. His ranch sat on 12,200 acres, and he knew every inch of it the way other people know their own houses. He was driving his truck along the east fence line that morning, checking the posts. After a windy night, when he saw the second ship come down across the creek, it landed in the lower pasture, his lower pasture, where 500 longhorn cattle were currently grazing. He stopped the truck. He got out. Then he stood in the cold morning air with his coffee thermos in one hand and watched the ship settle into the ground with a slow grinding thud that shook the earth under his boots. The cattle moved away from it, not panicking, just moving the way cattle move when something large and unfamiliar enters their space, sideways, slow, bunching up together, watching. Cal watched the ramp come down. He watched the Breath Scouts walk out in their dark suits, carrying their equipment, moving quickly across the grass in the direction of the creek. One of them turned and pointed a weapon at him. Cal looked at the weapon. He looked at the scout holding it. Then he looked back over his shoulder at the 500 longhorn cattle standing about 80 yards behind him, shifting and stamping and watching the ship with wide rolling eyes. "Son," he said, and in a voice that was very calm and very flat, "if you fire that thing, you're going to have a very bad afternoon." The scout fired a warning shot anyway. It went over Cal's head and hit the ground 20 ft past him with a crack and a flash of light. The cattle heard it. They felt it. 500 longhorns, each one weighing between 1,000 and 400 lb, decided at the same moment that they were done standing still. They turned and they ran, not away from Cal, toward the noise, toward the open ground, toward the direction the sound had come from, which was also the direction of the Breath ground team. The scouts scattered. They were faster than a human could move, and none of them were killed. But the 4 armored transports they had brought off the ship were not fast. That the herd went through the equipment line like a river through a fence. 2 transports flipped over completely. One was dragged sideways 30 ft before the cattle moved past it. The 4th was pinned against a boulder by the weight of animals pressing around it and had its undercarriage cracked open. Cal watched all of this without moving. When they herd had passed and the dust began to settle, he walked slowly toward the overturned vehicles. A Wrath scout was pulling himself up from the grass nearby, covered in dirt, making sounds that the translation device on his belt rendered poorly as a long sequence of what were probably not polite words. Cal looked at the damage. He looked at the scout. "I told you," he said. He got back in his truck and drove to the ranch house to use the radio. And the 3rd ship had made the worst choice of all. It had landed in Louisiana. The team leader was a VHT tactician named C, and he had requested the Louisiana site because the Delta gave them access to a large freshwater river system, which was something the VR needed for their water processing equipment. From orbit, the area looked manageable. Open water, low vegetation, flat terrain, easy extraction, simple setup. Sewer stepped off the ramp into ankle-deep mud and immediately sank to his knee. That was how it started. The bayou was not like anything the Breath had studied in their survey data. Their instruments had read it as a low-density wetland. What their instruments had not been designed to measure was the way everything in a Louisiana swamp was alive in ways that overlapped, entangled, and pushed against each other constantly. And the water was alive. The mud was alive. Logs were alive. Even the floating mats of vegetation that looked solid were alive and would hold your weight for exactly 2 steps before dropping you into dark water. Within 2 hours of landing, alligators had begun circling the base of the ship. They were not aggressive, not yet. But they were there present, watching the new thing in their water with the slow, patient attention that alligators had been giving to new things in their water. For 200 million years, a group of nutria, large orange-off semi-aquatic rodents that looked like someone had combined a beaver and a rat and given the result a bad attitude, found the external cable housing on the water processing unit and began chewing through it, not because they were attacking the breath, but because nutria chewed through things. That was what nutria did. They chewed through levees and dock supports and irrigation pipes and the roots of entire stands of trees. Cable housing was simply another thing to chew. Water moccasins discovered that the exhaust vents on the breath generators were warm spots in a Louisiana swamp were good spots. 3. Snakes set up residence in the vents. By the end of the first day, the generators began running hot. The engineers could not figure out why until one of them opened a vent panel and a water moccasin came out of it very fast and very unhappy. Sear sent a message to Orvac: I have lost 4 crew members to what the local fauna appeared to regard as a mild Tuesday. He meant lost in the sense of injured and temporarily out of action. But the phrasing was accurate in a way he had not intended. To the alligators and the nutria and the snakes, this was just a Tuesday. Nothing special was happening. New things had arrived in the swamp, and the swamp was doing what the swamp always did, absorbing, pressing, wearing things down, filling every gap with something wet and alive. 20 yards into the marsh, mostly invisible behind a screen of cypress knees and hanging moss, sat a man named Denny Arsenault in a flat-bottomed progue. Denny was 53 years old and had spent those years in and around this particular stretch of bayou. He trapped, he fished, he guided hunters through the marsh in the fall. He knew where the alligators nested and where the water moccasins den, and which channels were safe to run at night and which ones would put you into a submerged log before you knew it was there. And he had watched the breath ship come down from half a mile away, and he had paddled closer without making a sound. Now he was watching the chaos at the base of the ship with the focused, thoughtful attention of a man who has spent his life reading the behavior of wild things. He pulled a small waterproof notebook from his chest pocket and began writing. He was not writing a tactical plan. He was just writing down what he saw, where the alligators were moving, which direction the nutria came from, how the snakes used the warm vents. Information, detail, the same kind of notes he took every time he came out here, because you never knew what might be useful later. When he had filled 3 pages, he paddled home. He tied up his pirogue, went inside and got on the radio. He knew every trapper, fisherman, and swamp guide within 50 mi. Then he called them one by one. He told them what he had seen. He asked them to keep their eyes open and to call him if anything changed. Then he called Lucy Grant. He had never met Lucy. He had found her name in an online directory of wildlife researchers months ago and saved her number because someone had told him she was the person to call if you had unusual animal behavior to report. He was not sure this counted as unusual animal behavior exactly, but it seemed relevant. Lucy picked up. She listened to what Denny described. She asked a few questions. She wrote down his number. Keep watching, she said, and keep calling people. The more eyes on this, the better. Yes, ma'am, Denny said. He refilled his coffee, picked up his notebook and started thinking. Back in Montana, the Cal Burton was on the radio with a game warden named Lou Harris. Lou was a quiet, precise man who had spent 20 years managing wildlife in the Central Plains and knew the movement patterns of every major herd within 300 m. Cal explained what had happened that morning. Lou listened without interrupting. When Cal finished, Lou said, elk migration starts in 9 days. The big northern herd comes through that valley every year, Cal said. Through the lower pasture, Lou said. Right through the middle of it. There was a short silence. Well, Cal said, I suppose I am not going to fix that south fence section. After all, Lou did not laugh, but he was quiet for a moment in a way that might have been a laugh if he had been that kind of man. Neither of them said anything else about it. They did not need to. Somewhere above them in the fleet ship hanging in orbit high, Sovereign Z was reading the latest round of damage reports from all 3 ground sites. He read about the overturned transports in Montana. He read about the cable damage in Louisiana. He read about the Ravens. The Pacific Northwest. He had conquered 47 worlds. Not one of them had done this. He put down the reports and looked out the viewport at the blue-green planet below. It looked peaceful from up here, soft, full of water and cloud and green. He did not yet know about the elk. He would. High Sovereign ZTH had a war room on his flagship that was the size of a large house. The walls were covered in display screens, each one showing a different feed from the 3 ground teams below. He could see the Pacific Northwest compound from above. It gets perimeter lights blinking in the dark forest. He could see the Montana site where the engineering team was still trying to get 2 of the overturned transports back onto their wheels. He could see the Louisiana site where the water processing unit had been offline for 30 hours because of the cable damage. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at all of it. His generals were around him. They were experienced beings. They had run ground operations on many worlds. They had dealt with hostile native populations before. Populations with weapons, with armies, with organized resistance. They knew how to handle that kind of thing. You applied force, you broke the resistance, and the world submitted. It was a formula. It had always worked, but this was not that formula. Nobody on Earth was shooting at the breath. Nobody was launching missiles or organizing armies or broadcasting declarations of war. The humans near the landing sites were watching. Some of them were making notes. Some of them were talking on small communication devices. A few of them, like Cal Burton, were simply going back to their daily work after saying a single flat sentence, and yet the 3 ground teams were bleeding resources. Not from combat, from the land itself. ZTH looked at the total damage figures on the main screen. He had not seen numbers like these since a campaign early in his career, when they had tried to establish a base on a planet with a permanent electrical storm system that had been weather. This was animals. He turned to his lead general. What is their military doing? The general consulted his intelligence feed. Nothing coordinated that we can detect, or some communication between small settlements, some movement of individuals toward the landing zones but no weapons, mobilization, no troop movements, no official military response has been launched. ZTH frowned. Then why are our ground teams filing 12 damage reports a day? Nobody in the room had a good answer for that. Dan Cooper had been moving through the Olympic forest for 6 days now, sleeping rough, eating from his pack, checking in with Lucy by satellite phone every evening. He was not hiding exactly, he was just not drawing attention. He had a notebook full of observations about the breath compound, where the sensors were thinnest, where the fence had weak posts, where the drones flew on their patrol routes. He was not planning an attack, he was doing what he had always done. He was mapping behavior, and he was learning the patterns of a new kind of animal in his forest. He called Lucy on the evening of day 6. The drones fly the same route every time, he said. Perfectly regular, same altitude, same speed, same gap between them. Lucy was quiet for a moment. The wolves already know that, don't they? The pack has been timing their crossings, Dan said. They go under the drone gap every night. They are already moving through the perimeter without triggering the sensor, so the fence is already porous. Lucy said. Has been since day 2, Dan replied. I don't think the breath have figured that out yet. Lucy had been building something over the past several days. She had a contact list now. Biologists, park rangers, game wardens, naturalists spread across the country, all sharing what they knew. I'd not organized in any official way. No leader, no hierarchy, just people who knew the land, calling each other and passing information back and forth. Where the animals were, what they were doing, what was in their way, and what might be moved. Pete Owens had been the one to say it simply. They did not need to command the animals, they just needed to stop interfering with what the animals were already going to do. On the morning of day 9, the elk migration began. Lou Harris had known it was coming. He had been watching the northern herd via radio collar data for a week. They had been staging in the foothills, building their numbers, waiting for the temperatures to drop and the instinct to move south to become stronger than the instinct to stay. When they moved all at once. Roughly 2,000 animals, the big bulls first, and their antlers wide and dark, their breathing loud in the cold air. Then the cows and the young ones behind them, a river of brown bodies moving through the grass in the gray pre-dawn. The Verith, Montana compound sat directly in the middle of the migration corridor. Lou had not put the elk there. He had simply made sure the south fence section that Cal had not gotten around to fixing was still open, and that the salt block that he happened to have left in the lower field was still drawing the herd south on the exact track they had used every year for longer than anyone had a record of. The elk hit the perimeter at 3:00 a.m. They did not hit it like an attack, they hit it like a river hit something in its path, steady, continuous, massive, completely indifferent to the object's feelings about being hit. The sonic emitters fired. The elk did not care. The plasma fence discharged on the first animals to push through, and those animals stumbled and veered, and the ones behind them veered around them, and the herd split and flowed around the compound buildings and through the equipment lines and between the vehicles with the patient, unstoppable momentum of 2,000 large animals that had been making this trip their whole lives. The noise alone was something. The breath had no reference. For thousands of hooves on dry ground, at full movement combined with the bugling of the bulls, a sound like a brass horn played by something with no interest in music, and the crashing of equipment being knocked aside. Every alarm in the compound went off at once. The sensor board lit up completely. The system, which had been calibrated to track individual large organisms, had locked up entirely under the weight of 2,000 simultaneous readings. Sewers. Message from Louisiana arrived at almost the same hour. His sensor grid had crashed, not from the wildlife, from the sheer volume of noise the wildlife created. The motion tracking system had been trying to process dozens of small watercraft moving through the bayou in irregular patterns all night. Denny Arson and the network of trappers and fishermen he had organized were doing exactly what they always did, running their boats, checking their lines, moving through the marsh. They were not doing anything unusual. They were just doing their usual things all at the same time in the same area. And the breath system could not tell the difference between a trapper checking a crab trap and a coordinated military maneuver, and the system flagged everything as a potential threat. Then it flagged the flags as threats. Then it ran out of processing capacity and shut itself down. The Louisiana team was effectively blind. In the dark, in the Pacific Northwest, Dan Cooper made one phone call that evening. He called a colleague named Vera Miles, a wolf biologist who had been tracking the northern pack. He told her where the drone gap in the perimeter was. He asked her if she could make sure her radio collars were transmitting clearly so the data could be used to document the wolf movement through the area. That was all. Vera confirmed the collar data was transmitting. Dan thanked her and hung up. That night, the 3 radio-collared wolves in the northern pack moved through the drone gap in the breath perimeter. They walked directly through the biological sample collection tent, knocking over 6 weeks of carefully organized breath field research, sniffed around the camp for 20 minutes and left without incident. Pre had been in the tent when they arrived. He had pressed himself against the back wall and not moved until they were gone. When they left, he walked to the main ship, went inside, locked the door behind him, and did not come out for the rest of the mission. In the flagship above, ZTH called a war council. He looked at his generals. Bombardment. One of them said, orbital strikes on the landing zones, clear the area of all large organic life. ZTH looked at the bioscan data of the planet's surface. Almost everywhere he looked, the readings were thick with life, forests, grasslands, wetlands, oceans, and all of it dense and layered and alive. He did a calculation that he did not like the result of. If he bombarded the landing zones, the strikes would need to be large enough to clear the corridors the ground teams needed to operate in. Orbital bombardment at that scale would destabilize the regional biosphere, destabilize the biosphere, and the colony world became unusable. An unusable colony world was the one outcome the Dominion's expansion campaign could not justify. He had not come to this planet to burn it. He had come to take it, and the planet was making that very difficult. He sat down for the first time in hours. He looked at the screens. He looked at the footage of 2,000 elk moving through his Montana compound in the dark. He looked at the frozen Louisiana sensor grid. He looked at the Pacific Northwest Wolves I caught on a single functioning camera walking calmly out of the sample. Collection tent. Open a communication channel, he said. Quietly. To which human military command? The communications officer asked. To the nearest human settlement to the Pacific Northwest landing site, ZTH said. The channel connected. It rang twice. Dan Cooper picked up from the edge of a ridge where the signal was clear. Hello, he said. ZTH composed himself. The translator rendered his words into flat, careful English. We wish to discuss terms, it said. Dan looked across at Pete and Lucy, who were standing a few feet away, warming their hands over a small camp stove. Pete raised his eyebrows. Lucy turned back to her laptop. Hold on, Dan said into the phone. I need to move. There is a bear between me and the good signal spot. Silence on the breath end. A bear, ZTH repeated. She has cubs, Dan explained. Give me 2 minutes. ZTH held the line. He looked at his generals. His generals looked at each other. Nobody said anything. There was nothing to say. The bear moved away from the ridge after about 4 minutes. She was a large black bear with 2 cubs, and she had been working along the rocky edge of the slope looking for grubs under the loose stones. She was not interested in Dan Cooper. He was not between her and what she wanted. She gave him one long look, decided he was not worth the trouble, and led her cubs down the far side of the ridge toward the creek below. Dan watched her go. Then he stepped into the clearing where the signal was strong and spoke into the phone. Okay, he said. I'm here. High Sovereign. ZTH had spent the last 4 minutes in silence. His generals had not spoken. His communications officer had not moved. The entire war room had been very quiet, while an alien world's military commander waited for a wildlife biologist to find a better signal spot. It was ZTH would later reflect the moment he understood that this world was different from every other world he had ever tried to take. The conversation that followed was short. ZTH's translator turned his words into English in flat, careful phrases. He said that the Vreth Dominion wished to discuss the terms of their presence on Earth's surface. He said that the ground teams had experienced complications that required resolution. He used formal language, the kind of language built for negotiations between powers. Dan Cooper listened to all of this. Then he said, I am not the right person for this conversation. I am a wolf researcher. Z paused. You are the nearest human authority. I am not any kind of authority, Dan said, but I will pass your contact request to the right people. Give me a day. He hung up. Pete Owen looked at him. Did you just hang up on an alien fleet commander? He can call back, Dan said. Lucy was already typing. The formal negotiations that followed were handled by people far above Dan Cooper's level. Diplomats, government officials, military advisors, the kind of people who were supposed to handle these things. Dan gave them a contact frequency and went back to his field work. He had a wolf pack to track, and the mission had already been disrupted by 9 days of alien invasion. But the outcome of those negotiations was shaped entirely by what had already happened on the ground. I mean the forest and the grasslands in the bayou. In the 9 days before any diplomat got involved, the Breath had no leverage. They had landed on a world they did not understand, in terrain their equipment could not manage, surrounded by life that their technology could not deter. They had 3 broken ground teams. Crash sensor grid, a xenobiologist who had locked himself in a ship and refused to come out, and a damage bill that was growing every hour. They withdrew from Earth's surface after 19 days. ZTH filed his official report to the Dominion High Council from the flagship as it moved away from Earth's orbit. He described the withdrawal as a strategic reassessment pending further ecological survey. He used careful formal language, and he cited the unusual density of Earth's biosphere as a complicating factor requiring additional study before colonization could proceed. The High Council read the report and accepted it. None of them had a better explanation for what had happened, and none of them wanted to ask too many questions. When a commander who had conquered 47 worlds says he needs more time to study the ecology of the 48th, you accept that answer and move on. The xenobiologist requested a reassignment before the fleet had even cleared the solar system. He asked to be transferred to archival research, which was quiet and took place entirely indoors and did not involve going to planetary surfaces. His request was granted without any discussion. He spent the rest of his career writing. His subject was Earth's animal life, and he approached it with the focused intensity of someone who has been genuinely frightened and wants to understand why. He produced 12 volumes over the following years. They were dry and detailed and careful, and they were eventually added to the required reading list of Every Breath Military Academy under the title On the Inadvisability of Landing in Places You Have Not Fully Studied. Military officers across the Dominion read it. Most of them came away with a deep and lasting respect for Ravens. Sir, the Louisiana team leader, lost his commission after the formal inquiry into the mission's failures. He did not protest this. He had spent 19 days in a Louisiana swamp, and then he had come to a private conclusion that any species capable of making that environment their home and actually enjoying it was not a species the Dominion had any business provoking. He left the military and took a quiet position in administrative logistics, and he never discussed the mission publicly, not once. On Earth, the 19 days were talked about for a long time. Dan Cooper went back to his wolves. Pack had settled again after the disruption. Animals are practical things, and once the ships were gone, the forest went back to being the forest, and the wolves went back to being wolves. Naden filed a research paper the following spring on disrupted wolf movement patterns in the Olympic Peninsula during what he called in his abstract an unusual period of habitat disturbance. He mentioned the breath landing in a single footnote. The footnote was 4 lines long. His colleagues found this either very funny or very typical of him, depending on how well they knew him. Lucy Grant received a government research grant the following year, a significant one. The government had been paying close attention to what she had built during those 19 days. The informal network of biologists and rangers and naturalists who had been sharing information across the country, and they wanted to make it official and permanent. She accepted the funding with one condition: that the network remained flat with no central command structure. Just people sharing what they knew. The government agreed, mostly because they did not fully understand how the network had worked in the first place, and were not confident they could improve it. She spent the next 3 years building something that worked very well, and that most people in the government found difficult to explain in a briefing. Document. Pete Owens drove home after the withdrawal fixed the fence section he had left open for the elk corridor, turned down 17 interview requests from news organizations, and went back to guiding hunters through the back country. He did give one talk 2 years later at a small conference on wilderness management. He spoke for about 8 minutes. He said that the most important thing a person could know about wild country was that it did not need you to protect it, it needed you to get out of its way. He got a long round of applause which seemed to make him uncomfortable. Cal Burton gave one interview. It was to a local paper in Montana, and the reporter was a young woman who drove out to the ranch and sat with him on the porch and asked him what he thought Earth's greatest natural defense against alien invasion was. Cal thought about it. He drank his coffee. He looked out at the pasture where the longhorns were grazing in the late afternoon light. About 8 billion years of evolution that decided it liked being here, he said. The reporter waited for more. Cal shrugged and went back inside. That quote was picked up by larger papers and then by international news. Darwin then somehow made it into the formal diplomatic correspondence that Earth's newly created Planetary Contact Bureau began sending out to other space-faring civilizations that had been cautiously and carefully making their presence known since the breath incident. The Bureau received many responses. Most of them were polite and distant. A few were curious. One arrived unsigned with no return address from a species called the Thun, a civilization that was by all accounts ancient and careful and not given to unnecessary communication. It was short. In translation it read, "We have reviewed the survey data. We will not be visiting at this time. Please give our regards to the bears." Nobody knew who to give the regards to specifically, and since there were several hundred bears on Earth, and most of them were not aware they had a reputation, Lucy Grant printed the message out and taped it to her office wall. It hung there next to a photograph she had taken years earlier, a wolf pack moving through morning fog in the Olympic forest. Single file, quiet, unhurried, completely at home in a world that had been building itself around them for longer than anything with a spaceship had been looking at the sky. She looked at that photograph a lot in the months that followed, especially on days when the grant paperwork was frustrating or the network reports were slow. It reminded her of something simple and true. The world did not need to be extraordinary to defend itself. It just needed to be what it was, alive, layered, stubborn, and an older than anything that had ever tried to take it. That had always been enough. It still was, and somewhere out in the dark, between the stars and fleet ships and council chambers and the quiet offices of beings who charted which worlds were safe to approach and which were not, a small blue-green planet had moved very firmly to the bottom of a great many lists, not because it had the biggest weapons, not because it had the fastest ships or the most advanced technology, but because it had ravens that dismantled equipment out of curiosity, because it had bears that sat on sensor nodes while looking for salmon, because it had wolves that learned the gaps in a perimeter fence in 3 days and used them every night without being asked, because it had a man who would tell an alien fleet commander to hold on while a Mother Bear moved her cubs out of the way because it was at every level and in every corner completely and stubbornly and magnificently alive, and on this world that was the most dangerous thing of all.